Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. And today we are finally going to talk about the end of the topic we've been talking about all semester, the end of the Cold War. So Ronald Reagan believes that after the Vietnam War, the United States had lost its way. Rather than go with a policy of détente, he felt that the U.S. should seek to roll back Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and have a little more aggressive foreign policy. So Reagan believes that peace comes through military strength, which is a conservative ideal. And although it initially increases tension between the two superpowers, they also contribute to the end of the Cold War. Reagan's goal is to challenge communism every way possible without provoking war with the Soviet Union, which a lot of people thought that he was, and it was a very scary time. But he built up the military. He puts new nuclear missiles in Europe, and he also proposes something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, where land and space-based lasers would destroy Soviet missiles before they could hit the United States. And this was dubbed the Star Wars program because it was introduced during the heyday of the original Star Wars trilogy. Some think that it's unrealistic. Eventually it is unrealistic. It was never realized, but the Soviets took it very, very seriously and tried to increase their military spending, which basically bankrupted them. So some people say SDI led to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, or it at least aided in it. Reagan and Communism, basically, we also fund anti-communist rebels all over the world. We've already talked about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and also the Contras in Nicaragua. The new Sandinista government came to power because the Carter based his foreign policy on human rights and cut off business with the non-communist government in Nicaragua before that. And so the Contras are this group of anti-communist counter-revolutionaries battling against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. But they'll also get President Reagan in trouble with how he funds them, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. In 1983, a radical leftist movement attacks the tiny island of Grenada, or Grenada, however you want to say it. The U.S. troops invade this island to prevent the communist takeover, and there are also American medical students practicing there, so we want to keep them safe as well. Tiny island toward the south of the Caribbean. Mikhail Gorbachev begins a new era of Soviet rule, and he's the last premier of the Soviets there, and he begins in 1985. So well into Reagan's second term, he begins a new era of Soviet openness, and his two policies are known as glasnost and perestroika. And glasnost means a new openness for government activities. So we like to joke that before, the Soviet Union would just drag you out in the street and shoot you, but now they'll tell you why they're dragging you out in the street and shooting you. It's a more transparent government for people. Perestroika is more for the economy. He can't afford to keep a strict socialist economy anymore, so they're destroying themselves trying to keep up with the U.S. in the arms race. So this moves away from a socialist economy and gives business owners and people in the Soviet Union more of a choice, moving more towards the capitalist side of things. This policy is argued to be the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which ends the Cold War. So throughout Reagan's first term, he referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. But when Gorbachev becomes president, they actually become very good friends, and they meet 4 times between 1985 and 1989 and start working together toward better relations between the two superpowers. Toward the end of this time, in 1989, communism begins to fall in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and Yugoslavia. All those satellite states for the most part, peaceful revolutions, except in Czechoslovakia. They overthrow the governments and institute new democratic governments. And people were waiting for the Soviet Union and Gorbachev to do something, but he didn't. He let it happen. And so following the fall of the East German government eventually, East Berlin opens the gates to West Berlin for the first time in decades, and the Berlin Wall is torn down in 1989. And this event symbolizes the end of communism in Europe, and later on the next year, Germany is reunited into one country, as it remains today. In 1991, the communists attempt one last coup of Gorbachev to overthrow him so that the communists can remain in power, and it doesn't work. And the people, led by a man by the name of Boris Yeltsin, rallied in the streets in support of Gorbachev. But eventually in December of 1991, the Communist Party loses power, and Gorbachev signs a resolution that dissolves the Soviet Union and separates it into 15 different republics on December 26, 1991. Boris Yeltsin will become the new leader of Russia, or one of those, the largest of those 15 different republics. So here you can see the former Soviet Union and how it is divided up in alphabetical order. So you've got Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. All of these countries are now separate countries, but they used to be a part of the Soviet Union. So historians argue over and over, back and forth, did Reagan win the Cold War? Well, he did build up our economy quickly, which hastens the collapse of the Soviet economy when they tried to keep up with us. Gorbachev has to promote reform at home, and people didn't like that. And he also has to give up control of Eastern Europe because they can't afford to control them anymore. When we say no, we say Gorbachev's reform policies of glasnost and perestroika opened the door to rebellion against communist rule in Eastern Europe, and so the United States really had nothing to do with it. Either way, Reagan was there. His policies led to it, even though it happens during Bush's administration. Bush and Yeltsin established friendly relations between the two nations post-Cold War, and there's new questions to ask. Bush calls this the New World Order. We've been basing our foreign policy the past 40 or 50 years on the Soviet Union, but now since they're not there, do we need to decrease our military spending? And what direction do we need to take our foreign policy since we're the last superpower left? Well, Reagan also has some problems in the Middle East. Back in the 1980s, he fights with anti-U.S. Libya, and Libya supports terrorist groups who attack the United States, led by Muammar al-Gaddafi, who was recently killed here in the past decade in the Libyan civil war. U.S. warplanes bombed Libya after an attack on a Berlin nightclub. Remember, Berlin was still a part of the West Germany at that point. And in 1982, Reagan also sends 800 Marines to Lebanon to help in the Lebanese civil war. But somebody plants a truck bomb that kills 241 Marines in their barracks there, and then Reagan pulls the Marines the next year because it is too dangerous. And then finally, the Iran-Contra Affair. So there's two parts of this. There's Iran, and then there's Contra, or the Contras. The United States sells weapons to Iran in 1985 in exchange for them to pressure terrorist groups in Lebanon to release American hostages that they have. So we would sell them weapons only if they would pressure these terrorist groups who they hold sway over to release the American hostages. And this is technically negotiating with terrorists, and that has always been our policy not to do that. So the money we get from Iran, the first illegal thing we do, we use to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, even though in 1983 Congress bans funding them. So two illegal things here. The Iran part of it, getting money from Iran and terrorists to pressure terrorists, and using it to fund Contras. Two illegal things here. Reagan escapes without criminal charges. He delegated a lot of things in his administration, so it was entirely possible that he had no idea about this. Oliver North, a top aide, was convicted for the affair, and I believe you can see him on Fox News. He's a military analyst now, so he might be on Fox News, I believe, but so he's still around. But Oliver North was convicted for the affair. And that's all I have for you today. Be sure to fill out your learning targets and bring them back here to class with any questions you may have. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.